Thank you for that very nice introduction. It's a good way to start. And I also would like to thank the Institute of Medicine and the National Research Council for sponsoring this workshop, and for the planning committee for putting this together, and also thank them for inviting the three of us to write a review paper. It's a topic that we talk about frequently, but often, kind of say, oh, well, we don't really have time to really go explore that in depth, and so you don't do it. So it was really nice to have that opportunity and that challenge to go look at some of the research on parenting during the transition to adulthood and what we know. And I would also like to thank Claire Stroud and Doug Konofsky for their assistance in putting everything together and answering all my questions via email and all that good stuff. So thank you very much. How do I, down? The arrow, thank you. Mark Twain in 1939 said, "When I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much the old man had learned in 7 years." I think this is an excellent example, going back to, the 1930s, in terms of illustrating a young adult who left home, got a fresh perspective on his father and hopefully his mother, and came back home and was like, oh, this is a person maybe I can talk to or interact with or maybe share some thoughts with, and not so ignorant as I thought. And I think that parents have the same reaction when their children come home the first time from maybe their first tour of service in the military or for boot camp, or they come home for Christmas break after their first year of college, or they go off and get a job, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, you really are a real person and you have some ideas of your own, and maybe I could talk to you about more things than just arguing over who's going to pay the car insurance and how I'm going to get that next round of textbooks at school, or how I'm going to pay the first and last month's deposit on this apartment that I want so that I can go be somewhat independent from my family. So I think that it's good to remind us that this issue has been long-standing, but I think it's also started to change. So I briefly want to just talk a little bit about redefining young adulthood, and actually yesterday's talks all hit on various aspects of this, so it was really a nice setup for our panel this morning in terms of addressing a lot of these issues. People brought up the thing that, well, we have all of these different roles, and we have different expectations about these roles and about the timing of when we take on those roles. And we used to think that there was kind of a set order that people went through when they did that, and that is really no longer the case. It's no longer an orderly accumulation of roles and taking on of things, but it's taking on those roles depending on where your life experience is taking you. And in fact, parents and young adults have pretty good agreement on this in terms of there's a lot of things that I want to try out here. I'm not quite sure what order I'm going to do them in, and there are also some personal characteristics and social processes that young adults and their parents are trying to address during this time. One of the favorite articles that I came across doing this review was called, "If You Want Me to Treat You Like an Adult, Then Start Acting Like One." And it was a study where they interviewed both the parents and the young adults to get at their perspectives on what constitutes young adulthood and how do you know when you've gotten there. And so parents were much more interested in norm compliance and following the rules, but they also were interested in personal responsibility and some autonomy from parents. Adolescents, young adults kind of flipped that. They were much more interested in the autonomy from the parents and having some financial independence, although these were all college students, so None of them were financially independent, but they also agreed somewhat on the norm compliance. One of the things they tested on norm compliance was don't do drunk driving. There was agreement between parents and young adults on that. And so these changing expectations impact both the young adults and their parents and the expectations that they have of each other. And one difficulty that parents encounter is that we as a society don't have clear rites of passage that signal when you're going into young adulthood. The one marker we probably have is graduation from high school. And that's kind of it. And then you reach 18, you can join the military, you can vote, you still can't drink until you're the age 21, you can't even rent a rental car until you're age 25 and have a valid credit card. So there are all kinds of signals that you're getting from society that you're not a young adult, and parents are increasingly expected to try to fill this knowledge gap in for these young adults and prepare them for whatever is coming next. And society expects that you meet these expectations and guide your child along this path, regardless of what path your child has chosen. And so one of the things that I wanted to do today was to remind us that we don't need to reinvent the wheel in terms of looking at parenting of young adults. It has its roots in childhood and adolescence. And so we can go back to what works well in adolescence, and Larry Steinberg did a great review in 2001. He says we know some things, and that's still true today. We know some things in terms of what works well for parents and for young adults. And one of the challenges is that we're now trying to advise 21st century children, which is why I think it's perfect that parenting is coupled with social media. We've got 21st century children with 20th century parents trying to catch up and just one step behind in terms of, my kids finally got me to get an iPhone a year ago. And then they said, well, if you have an iPhone, you have to have an iPad. And then, that's been a real change. They're like, okay, so now you can keep up with us a little bit, which is great. And the other thing that we need to keep in mind is the changing economy, not just focusing on the Great Recession, but that parents have a hard time advising their children about what's coming next because the economy is no longer what they experienced when they were young adults coming out of college. And so they have to be much more flexible in terms of their outlook at what they address. So we discovered 5 themes that were built on how we parent children and adolescents. So warmth and support is the general good parenting that we know that we need to do. Also clear expectations, and I think that that still applies in young adulthood so that we help them know what parents expect and what society expects. Reasonable consequences for things that are happening, helping young adults identify what happens when you violate social norms, meeting the physical needs, and helping children make social connections. And so one of our challenges then is how do we identify similar effective behaviors that help parents of young adults? So one of the things that we can do, there's not much literature out there on parenting young adults per se. There are a few studies that have mentioned it, but they usually skip right over and look directly at the outcomes of the young adults in terms of what's happening with them. There's general agreement that we found in the few studies that do exist between parents and young adults as to what is important. And one of the biggest challenges is that both parents and their young adult children have to acknowledge that their relationship is changing. Once they become an adult, once they're eligible to do their own things, they can't go back to the parent being in charge and saying, you'll do it because I say so, you'll do it because you're living under my roof, you're doing it because I'm paying for it, and other strategies that parents can use don't work as well when your child is now a young adult. So 5 themes that we identified were communication, social support is still in there as a very important thing. Personal responsibility and independence is an important skill that parents have to help their young adults take on. Economics, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, so I'm glad people mentioned that in a number of talks. And mutual respect, so that both parents and young adults respect each other's feelings about things. And it's all built on a foundation of what came first, the parent and child history. I did a focus group with some young adults and talked about some of these 5 themes, and they said, yeah, but you have to remember that what their relationship was like in childhood and adolescence is really going to inform the parenting that they're able to provide to these young adults going forward. So communication is not a new issue, but the dynamics change. So once when you could remind your kids about homework, now if you call them up or text them and say, well, did you get that assignment turned in your philosophy class? They're like, that's not appreciated and may be seen as intrusive. You can no longer schedule doctors and dentist appointments for your young adults. And in fact, the HIPAA and the FERPA, and those are footnoted in the article for those of you who don't know what those are, may be seen as intrusive questions by parents. And so now young adults are protected by privacy, legal issues related to privacy. And so they can start to control the information that they are sharing with their parents. And for those who had poor communication patterns during adolescence, one of the things is a challenge is how do you overcome those poor communication patterns moving into young adulthood? And that's where other family members, including siblings, may help bridge that divide. On social support, Rick Settersten mentioned interdependence yesterday as a basis for a healthy relationship, and I think that still applies. And so I wanted to give a particular address to the parenting and the money issue. And so we really found 2 issues. So financial support that the parents provide, where is the money coming from? Parents have to make decisions, particularly parents who do not have the resources to provide for their children going to college like they thought they were going to. They have to make a decision. Do I put money into my retirement or do I pay for my son's or daughter's college education? That becomes a real issue and something that family members have to discuss. The other big issue, and there's a growing body of research on financial socialization, where parents can help children understand how to manage money. They can decide on, how to take smart debt. Do you get a degree from Harvard, or do you go to the public university and get a degree that might work just as well, and you're not going to be in debt for the next 30 years to get that degree? And also, most parents have more than one child, so they also have to think about how do they handle siblings and moving forward with making financial decisions. One of the things that also came up was, how do parents get information? What if your young adult is not going to college? There are a lot of parent handbooks if your child is going to college. They tell you everything from A to Z on how to apply and find a dorm and how to help them with homework and all kinds of stuff. But how do we reach parents of non-college youth? There are not places where they hang out. Once people leave high school, there aren't the normal groups that parents associate in where it's easy to reach them. There are also some barriers to good parenting. Almost all parents have high hopes and expectations for their young children, but there are barriers and constraints such as the parents' own mental and physical health, parents who are divorced, so now you've got 2 sets of communication patterns going on. There also may be poverty involved. Another barrier for youth may be homeless youth, so they have no parents to refer to whatsoever. And I can see I'm going to run over a minute or 2. Sorry, I thought I would have not enough to say, but that's what happens when I talk about one of my favorite topics. Vulnerable youth in particular may find adult mentors that may substitute for parents. And so there's some interesting research by Michelle Dang in Sacramento, and Les Whitbeck in the Midwest, looking at homeless youth and avenues to support that can help them make decisions moving into young adulthood. So future directions. I want to reiterate the forgotten half, which is great because that's come up a number of times. So, and the forgotten half really includes those who have no college, have maybe started college, they've dropped out, they've done technical and vocational training, maybe they've gone into the military. There's all kinds of routes that they've taken that are not college. And so we don't have nearly as much information on them, and we really need to figure out how to correct that. So for instance, one example I want to draw on the military, there's a new program for returning veterans, and it's called The Mission Continues for post 9/11 veterans, in terms of getting them into the community, helping them find jobs, creating social networks, and that also can help those young adults coming back into communities and can help their parents as well. We also need to keep in mind immigrant youth, not only immigrant status, but also their generational status, whether or not they speak the same language as their parents. Is there two languages in the family, and that makes it difficult for parents to parent and help them make decisions? That's some evidence that we have from our Mexican-American study, that it does make a difference in parenting if you prefer English and your parents prefer Spanish. It creates a barrier. We also need to acknowledge, in terms of looking at what's good parenting, the role of race, ethnicity, culture, and religion. And so we need to keep that in mind in terms of that can provide opportunities and may also provide barriers. We also need to think about linking research, policy, and application. And I wanted to quote Schoenkoff here: "Science is focused on what we do not know, and social policy and the delivery of health and human services are focused on what we should do." So one of the challenges is that scientists want to take time and look at all of the issues from multiple perspectives and then come up with really solid recommendations. But social policy makers and program providers need information right now, and they want to get into the field, and so there's this push-pull between coordinating between research, policy, and application. And I'm going to skip over the effects of the Great Recession because I think that was addressed well in a couple of other talks. So final thoughts. I want to come back to where we started in terms of looking at the hallmarks of good parenting in adolescence and take them forward into young adulthood. So warmth and support really requires that we have communication between equals, or almost equal. The parents still know more things than their young adult children do, and they need to work on that, and also that support works two ways. Clear expectations, and these expectations now are developed in consultation with the young adult instead of being driven from the top down by the parents. Reasonable consequences really start to move into the direction of making decisions and self-regulation by the young adult, but they need support by adults in their life to make those decisions and how they learn how to do self-regulation around all kinds of issues. Physical needs, young adults now have to take responsibility for their own physical needs, and also social connections. Parents can help you make social connections, but one of the most valuable skills that parents can do for their young adults is to help them learn to make social connections with lots of different people. And I think our panel of young adults were marvelous in terms of talking about the experiences that they had with youth leadership development and 4-H, and how that made a difference in terms of their comfort level of making connections with other people. So as the transition to adulthood expands, there needs to be a fundamental shift in how we view young adults, and there also needs to be a shift in terms of parents. Parents can't do this alone, and it needs to be a collaborative effort across disciplines in terms of how we plan out our research agenda, and there also needs to be a collaborative effort between public, civic, religious institutions, and parents and young adults in preparing the next generation of adults to take their place in society. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we're going to focus on social networks and social media, and we'll be hearing from Lynn Clark, who is Associate Professor in Film Media and Journalism Studies with the University of Denver, where she also directs the Eslope International Center for Journalism and New Media. She's working on a few projects currently that bear direct relevance to her presentation today, specifically the Teens and New Media at Home project, which explores the introduction of digital and mobile media into U.S. and family life. The Young Media Makers project, which is studying how the process of media making contributes to citizenship and civic engagement. And also the Global Students Online project, which is studying the possibilities for enhanced intercultural understanding through online interactions. Lynn?